Imagine changing the way the entire world works. Not just your town, not just your country, the entire world. Imagine creating a system so powerful that more than a century later, companies still use versions of it. Imagine helping millions of ordinary people afford something that was once considered a luxury. That is the story of Henry Ford, one of the most influential businessmen in history. A man who didn't invent the automobile, but transformed it forever. Before Henry Ford, cars were expensive, slow to produce, and available only to wealthy people. After Henry Ford, cars became accessible to ordinary families. Cities changed, travel changed, business changed, and modern life changed. But his journey was not a straight path to success. It was filled with failures, criticism, financial struggles, and moments when many people believed he would never succeed. Hello, my amazing students, and welcome again to your channel. My name is Clara, and today we're going to explore the fascinating life of Henry Ford, how he revolutionized transportation, built one of the world's most famous companies, and left a legacy that continues to influence modern industry. At the same time, you'll improve your English listening skills, vocabulary, speaking confidence, and overall English fluency through this inspiring biography. So, let's begin. Henry Ford was born on July 30th, 1863, on a farm in the state of Michigan in the United States. At first glance, there was nothing extraordinary about his surroundings. Fields, animals, farm work, a quiet rural life. Yet even as a child, Henry Ford seemed different. While many children were interested in games, Ford was fascinated by machines. He wanted to know how things worked, why they worked, and whether they could work better. Now imagine a young boy receiving a pocket watch. Most children would simply use it to tell the time. Henry Ford did something else. He took it apart, piece by piece. Not because he wanted to break it, because he wanted to understand it. He wanted to see what was inside, how all the parts worked together. And once he understood it, he put it back together again. That curiosity would shape the rest of his life. Now here's something interesting. People in his community soon noticed his unusual talent. Neighbors often brought broken watches and small machines to him. Even as a teenager, Ford had already developed a reputation as someone who could fix mechanical problems. Imagine that, a young boy becoming known as the local machine expert. Long before he became famous, long before he became wealthy, long before the Ford Motor Company even existed. Now, despite growing up on a farm, Henry Ford wasn't passionate about farming. He respected hard work, but his interests were elsewhere. Machines fascinated him far more than crops. Engines fascinated him far more than farm life. And as he grew older, that fascination only became stronger. Now let's think about the world he lived in. The late 19th century was a period of enormous change. Technology was advancing rapidly. Factories were expanding. Railroads were connecting cities. New inventions were appearing everywhere. The Industrial Revolution was transforming society, and Henry Ford wanted to be part of that transformation. Now imagine being a young man surrounded by exciting new inventions. Everywhere you look, technology is changing the world. For someone like Ford, it must have felt like an age of endless possibilities. Eventually, he left the farm and moved to Detroit. At the time, Detroit was becoming an important industrial city. There, Ford found work as a machinist, a person who builds and repairs machines. This was exactly the type of environment he loved. Every day, he learned more about mechanics, more about engineering, more about how machines functioned. And perhaps most importantly, he gained practical experience. Now here's a lesson many successful people share. Curiosity alone is not enough. Knowledge alone is not enough. Eventually, ideas must be combined with action. Ford wasn't simply reading about machines, he was working with them, touching them, repairing them, learning from them. And that hands-on experience became incredibly valuable. Now, one of the most important moments in Ford's life came when he encountered the gasoline engine. At the time, automobiles were still rare. Many people viewed them as strange experiments. Some people believed they would never replace horses. Others thought they were unreliable toys. But Ford saw something different. He saw potential. Enormous potential. He believed machines could transform transportation. And he became obsessed with making that vision a reality. Now, imagine believing in an idea that most people around you don't fully understand. That requires confidence, patience, and persistence. Because new ideas are often met with skepticism. People are comfortable with what they already know. And at that time, horses had been the primary form of transportation for thousands of years. Replacing them seemed almost impossible. But Henry Ford wasn't focused on what existed. He was focused on what could exist. Now, while working various jobs, Ford spent much of his free time experimenting, building, testing, learning, failing, trying again. Many nights were spent working on engines and mechanical designs, not because someone forced him to, because he genuinely loved the challenge. Now, here's something powerful. Many people dream. Many people have ideas. But relatively few people are willing to spend years developing those ideas. Ford was. And that's one reason his story became extraordinary. Success didn't arrive immediately. In fact, it was still far away. There would be setbacks, financial difficulties, failed businesses, and moments when success seemed uncertain. But those early years gave him something valuable: knowledge, experience, and a deep understanding of machines. Now imagine looking at a future automobile empire, millions of vehicles, factories around the world, one of the most famous brands in history. All of that began with a curious boy who loved taking things apart. A boy who wanted to understand how machines worked. A boy who saw possibilities where others saw ordinary objects. And that's one of the most important lessons from Henry Ford's early life. Great achievements often begin with simple curiosity. A question, an interest, a fascination. Something that captures your attention and refuses to let go. For Henry Ford, that fascination was machines, and it would eventually change the world. By the 1890s, Henry Ford had become completely fascinated by automobiles. Not the automobiles we know today. Those didn't really exist yet. At the time, cars were experimental machines, rare, expensive, and often unreliable. Most people still relied on horses for transportation. In fact, many people believed horses would always dominate the roads. But Henry Ford saw a different future. He imagined a world where ordinary people could own cars. A world where transportation would be faster, easier, and more accessible. And he was determined to help create it. Now imagine spending countless evenings after work experimenting with engines and mechanical parts. That's exactly what Ford did. While working as an engineer, he used his free time to build his own vehicle, piece by piece, part by part, failure after failure, until finally, in 1896, he completed his first automobile. He called it the quadricycle. Now here's something fascinating. The quadricycle looked very different from modern cars. It had 4 bicycle wheels, a simple frame, and a small gasoline engine. It was basic, very basic. But it worked. And for Henry Ford, that was all that mattered. The dream was becoming real. Now imagine the excitement, years of curiosity, years of experimentation, and finally, the machine moves. The vehicle actually works. It must have been an incredible moment. But success was still far away. Building one working automobile was difficult. Building a successful company would be much harder. Now, here's a lesson many people forget. When we look at successful individuals, we often see the success. We don't see the failures that came first. And Henry Ford experienced plenty of failures. His first automobile company failed, completely. Investors became frustrated. Money disappeared. The business collapsed. For many people, that would have been the end, but not for Henry Ford. Now think about that for a moment. Imagine working for years on a dream, launching a company, and then watching it fail. Many people would give up. Many people would conclude they weren't good enough. Many people would move on. Ford did the opposite. He learned, adjusted, and tried again. Now, here's something important. Failure gave him valuable information. He began understanding what worked, what didn't work, what customers wanted, and how automobiles could be improved. Sometimes failure teaches lessons that success cannot. Now, after his first failure, Ford launched another company. And once again, things didn't go according to plan. Conflicts emerged. Disagreements appeared. The company struggled. And eventually, Ford left. Another setback, another disappointment, another obstacle. Yet he kept going. Now imagine hearing criticism after criticism, people questioning your ideas, investors losing confidence, businesses failing. Most people would feel discouraged, but Henry Ford had something powerful, a clear vision. He believed ordinary people deserved affordable transportation, and that vision kept him moving forward. Now here's where the story becomes exciting. Ford realized something many competitors had missed. Most automobile companies focused on wealthy customers. Their vehicles were expensive, luxury products. Only a small percentage of society could afford them. Ford wanted something different. He wanted cars for ordinary people, farmers, workers, families, regular citizens. That idea would eventually change history. Now, in 1903, after years of experimentation and multiple failures, Henry Ford and a group of investors founded the Ford Motor Company. This time, things were different. The company started small, very small. In fact, during its early days, success was far from guaranteed. The automobile industry itself was still uncertain. Nobody knew which companies would survive. Nobody knew how large the market would become. Nobody knew whether automobiles would truly replace horses. The future remained unclear. Now imagine being one of those early employees, working inside a young company with enormous ambitions, believing you were helping create something revolutionary. It must have been both exciting and risky. Now, here's another fascinating detail. Henry Ford was not interested in creating the most expensive car. He wasn't interested in building products only for the rich. His goal was scale. He wanted millions of people to own automobiles. And that goal shaped every decision he made. Now think about how unusual that was. Many businesses focus on exclusivity. Ford focused on accessibility. He wanted to bring technology to ordinary people, and that mindset would become one of his greatest strengths. Now, the Ford Motor Company began producing automobiles. Sales slowly increased. The company started growing. Customers became interested. Confidence improved. But Henry Ford still hadn't achieved the breakthrough that would make him famous. That breakthrough was coming, and when it arrived, It would transform not only the automobile industry, but manufacturing itself. Because Henry Ford was about to introduce an idea that would change the way products were built all around the world. An idea so powerful that factories still use versions of it today. The moving assembly line. And with it, Henry Ford would become one of the most influential industrialists in human history. By the early 1900s, Henry Ford had finally built a company. The Ford Motor Company was growing. Cars were being produced. Customers were buying them. But Ford wasn't satisfied, not even close, because his real dream had never been to build cars for the wealthy. His dream was much bigger. He wanted to build a car that ordinary people could afford, a car for workers, farmers, families, a car for everyday life. And that dream led to one of the most important products in business history, the Model T. Now imagine the automobile industry at that time. Cars existed, but they were expensive, very expensive. For many families, owning a car was simply impossible. Automobiles were often viewed as luxury products, something for rich people, something for businessmen, something for the elite. Henry Ford wanted to change that, and in 1908, he introduced the Model T, a simple automobile, reliable, durable, easy to repair, and most importantly, affordable. Now here's something fascinating. Ford wasn't trying to create the most beautiful car. He wasn't trying to create the most luxurious car. He was trying to create the most useful car. And that made all the difference. Because ordinary people didn't need luxury. They needed transportation. They needed something practical. And the Model T delivered exactly that. Now imagine being a farmer living far from town. Traveling by horse could take hours. The Model T changed everything. Imagine a family wanting to visit relatives. The Model T made travel easier. Imagine workers commuting greater distances. The Model T opened new possibilities. Suddenly, mobility increased dramatically, and life began changing. Now here's the incredible part. The Model T became enormously successful. Demand exploded. People wanted cars, lots of cars, more cars than Ford could easily produce. And that's where another revolutionary idea appeared, the moving assembly line. Now, before the assembly line, building a car was slow. Workers often built large portions of a vehicle themselves. The process required significant time. As a result, production remained limited. Costs remained high. Ford wanted something different. He wanted speed, efficiency, scale. Now imagine a factory where, instead of workers moving around the car moves to the workers. Each worker performs a specific task, again and again and again. One worker installs a part. The next worker installs another part. The next worker performs another step. The vehicle keeps moving. The process keeps flowing. This became the moving assembly line, and it changed manufacturing forever. Now, here's something remarkable. Before the assembly line, building a car could take more than 12 hours. After Ford introduced his system, production time dropped dramatically. The difference was astonishing. Factories became more productive, cars became cheaper, and more people could afford them. Now think about the scale of this achievement. Ford wasn't simply improving his company, he was transforming an entire industry. In fact, he was influencing industries around the world. Because other manufacturers noticed what was happening. They saw the efficiency, they saw the results, and many adopted similar methods. Even today, modern factories still use principles inspired by Ford's innovations. Now, let's talk about another surprising decision. In 1914, Henry Ford shocked the business world. At a time when many factory workers earned relatively low wages, Ford announced that many employees would receive $5 per day. This was much higher than what many competitors paid. People were stunned. Some business leaders thought he was making a terrible mistake. But Ford saw things differently. He believed better paid workers would be more productive, more loyal, and more capable of buying products themselves, including automobiles. Now imagine being a factory worker during that period, suddenly earning significantly more money than before. The announcement attracted enormous attention. Workers wanted jobs at Ford. Newspapers covered the story, and the company became even more famous. Now here's something important. Not everyone admired Henry Ford. Like many powerful historical figures, he was a complex person. Some of his views and actions later became controversial. Historians continue debating different aspects of his legacy, and that's one reason studying history is important. People are rarely perfect. Even highly successful individuals often have flaws. But despite those debates, his influence on industry remains undeniable. Now imagine the world before Ford's innovations. Cars were rare, production was slow, manufacturing was limited. Then imagine the world after. Millions of automobiles, modern factories, mass production. Entire industries transformed. The difference is extraordinary. And that's why Henry Ford became one of the most influential businessmen in history. He didn't invent the automobile, but he helped make it accessible to millions. He didn't invent factories, but he transformed how factories worked. He didn't simply build a company, he helped reshape modern industrial society. And his greatest impact was still growing. Because the success of the Model T would turn Ford Motor Company into one of the most powerful businesses in the world, and Henry Ford into a global icon. By the 1910s, Henry Ford was no longer simply an inventor. He was becoming one of the most famous businessmen in the world. The Model T was selling in enormous numbers. Factories were producing vehicles at unprecedented speed, and Ford Motor Company was growing rapidly. What had started as a risky dream was turning into a global empire. Now imagine the scale of what was happening. Every year, more people wanted automobiles. Roads were improving, cities were expanding, transportation was changing, and Ford was at the center of it all. The Model T became so popular that at one point, nearly half of all cars in the United States were Fords. Think about that. Almost everywhere you looked, you could see a Ford automobile. That's how dominant the company had become. Now, here's something fascinating. Ford's success wasn't limited to America. His company expanded internationally. Factories appeared in different countries. Ford vehicles reached new markets, and the Ford name became recognized around the world. This was long before modern globalization, long before the internet, long before international business became as common as it is today. Yet Ford was already building a global brand. Now imagine seeing a Ford factory being built in another country, thousands of miles away from Detroit. The company's influence was spreading across continents, and with every new factory, Ford's manufacturing ideas spread as well. Now let's talk about one of Henry Ford's greatest strengths: vision. He constantly thought about efficiency. How could production become faster? How could costs become lower? How could ordinary people benefit from technology? These questions guided many of his decisions, and they helped him achieve extraordinary success. But success often creates new challenges. Now here's something many people don't realize. The qualities that help a person become successful can sometimes create problems later. Henry Ford was confident, very confident. He trusted his instincts. He believed strongly in his own ideas. Those traits helped him build an empire. but they also made him resistant to change at times. Now let's look at an example. The Model T had been incredibly successful. For years, customers loved it. Ford loved it too. In fact, he loved it so much that he was reluctant to change it. Meanwhile, competitors were evolving. Other automobile companies began offering new designs, more features, more choices, different colors, different styles. Customers started wanting variety. But Henry Ford remained focused on the Model T, for longer than many people thought he should. Now imagine running one of the world's most successful companies. Everyone is telling you to change, but you've built your success by trusting your own judgment. That's a difficult situation, and eventually, Ford had to adapt. A lesson that applies to everyone. No matter how successful you become, the world continues changing, and adaptation remains essential. Now, here's another important aspect of his story. Henry Ford wasn't only building cars, he was influencing society. Automobiles changed where people lived, how people traveled, how businesses operated, how cities developed. Entire industries grew because cars became more accessible. Gas stations, road construction, tourism, automobile repair. Countless businesses benefited from the transportation revolution. Now think about that. One innovation creating opportunities for millions of people. That's the kind of impact Henry Ford had. Now, let's go deeper. Ford also believed strongly in self-improvement and practical knowledge. He admired hard work, discipline, and problem-solving. Many people viewed him as a symbol of the American dream, a person who rose from modest beginnings to extraordinary success. His story inspired entrepreneurs around the world, people who wanted to build businesses, create products, and solve problems. Now, of course, success did not eliminate criticism. Ford faced controversy throughout his life. Some of his public statements attracted criticism. Some of his decisions created debate. Historians continue discussing these issues today, and that's an important reminder. Historical figures are often complicated. Their achievements can be remarkable. Their mistakes can also be significant. Understanding both sides helps us see history more clearly. Now imagine the pressure Henry Ford faced, running a giant company, managing thousands of employees, competing in a rapidly changing industry, making decisions that affected millions of customers. The responsibility was enormous. Yet despite the challenges, Ford Motor Company continued growing, and the Ford name became permanently connected to the automobile industry. By the 1920s, Henry Ford was one of the most famous individuals on Earth. Not a king, not a president, not a military leader, a businessman, an innovator, a person whose ideas transformed everyday life. And yet, the most important part of his legacy wasn't wealth. It wasn't fame. It wasn't even automobiles. It was the way he changed manufacturing itself. Because long after Henry Ford was gone, his methods would continue shaping factories, businesses, and industries across the globe. And that's exactly what we'll explore in the final part of his story. When people hear the name Henry Ford, they usually think about cars, the Model T, Ford Motor Company, factories, assembly lines. And while all of those things are important, they're only part of the story. Because Henry Ford's greatest legacy may not be the automobiles he built. It may be the way he changed how the world works. Now think about this. Before Henry Ford's innovations, many products were expensive and difficult to produce. Factories existed, manufacturing existed, but production was often slow, limited, and costly. Ford helped change that. His assembly line transformed manufacturing. Products could be produced faster, more efficiently, and at lower costs. As a result, goods became more affordable for ordinary people, and that idea spread far beyond automobiles. Now imagine a modern factory. Whether it produces cars, electronics, appliances, or countless other products, many of its methods can be traced back to ideas that Henry Ford helped popularize, more than a century later. That's remarkable. Now, here's something fascinating. Most successful people leave behind companies. Some leave behind inventions. A few leave behind ideas that reshape entire industries. Henry Ford did all three. And that's one reason his name remains famous today. Now, let's talk about legacy. What does legacy actually mean? A legacy is what remains after you're gone, the impact you leave behind, the influence you have on future generations. And Henry Ford's legacy is enormous. Millions of people gained access to transportation because of his vision. Factories around the world adopted his methods. Businesses studied his strategies. Entrepreneurs learned from his successes, and even from his mistakes. Now, here's an important point. History is rarely simple. Henry Ford was not a perfect person. Like many influential figures, he had strengths and weaknesses, achievements and controversies, ideas that transformed society, and views that have been criticized. That's why understanding history requires balance. We can admire accomplishments while also recognizing flaws, and that makes historical figures more human, not less. Now imagine if we only studied perfect people. History would be very short, because perfection doesn't exist. Real people are complicated, and Henry Ford was no exception. Now let's focus on one of the most valuable lessons from his life: persistence. Because if you look at Ford's journey carefully, success did not arrive immediately. His first businesses failed, investors lost confidence, projects collapsed, criticism appeared, obstacles emerged repeatedly. Yet he continued, again and again and again. Many people see success and assume the path was smooth, but most successful stories are filled with setbacks. Henry Ford's story certainly was. Now, here's another lesson. Vision matters. Ford saw possibilities that many others ignored. While most people saw automobiles as luxury items, he imagined them becoming everyday necessities. That ability to see a different future helped separate him from competitors. And vision often works that way. Great innovators don't simply react to the present. They imagine what the future could become. Now let's talk about adaptability. Even though Ford became famous for innovation, he also learned a difficult lesson. Success today doesn't guarantee success tomorrow. The market changes. Technology changes, customers change, and eventually, companies must adapt. This lesson remains just as important today as it was during Ford's lifetime. Now imagine a business refusing to change while the world evolves around it. Eventually, problems appear. That's why continuous learning remains important. Whether you're building a company, learning English, or pursuing any goal, growth requires adaptation. Now here's a lesson especially relevant for English learners. Henry Ford didn't become successful because he knew everything. He became successful because he kept learning, kept experimenting, kept improving. And language learning works exactly the same way. Nobody becomes fluent overnight. Nobody masters a skill instantly. Progress happens through consistent effort, small improvements repeated over time, just like Ford's success. Now imagine the young boy who used to take apart watches on a farm in Michigan. Could he have imagined what his future would become? Probably not. Could he have imagined millions of vehicles carrying the Ford name around the world? Probably not. Could he have imagined becoming one of the most famous businessmen in history? Probably not. Yet it happened. not because of luck alone, but because curiosity became knowledge. Knowledge became action. Action became experience, and experience became success. Now, here's the deeper lesson of Henry Ford's story. Extraordinary achievements often begin with ordinary interests. A curiosity, a passion, a question. Something that captures your attention. Something you're willing to keep working on long after others lose interest. For Henry Ford, that interest was machines. For you, it may be something completely different. English, business, technology, art, science, whatever it is, great journeys often start small. Now, imagine looking back on your own life years from now. What skills did you develop? What challenges did you overcome? What impact did you create? Those questions matter, because in the end, Henry Ford's story is not only about automobiles. It's about curiosity, persistence, vision, innovation, and the incredible things that can happen when someone refuses to stop learning. And perhaps that's why his story continues inspiring people more than 100 years later. Not because he built cars, but because he showed what is possible when determination meets opportunity.